Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thank you very much for inviting me to Kaliningrad. It's really an experience, my first time in Russia. I'm really pleased to be here. So thank you very much for the generous reception as well. So I'll be talking about note-taking for consecutive interpreting, and what I will do I will be really specific, very concrete. I think and some of you are MA students, many of you are MA students, so I think I will perhaps be very clear. And what I will do is I will give you some examples of my own research mainly, and I will give you as many examples as time allows. Really, I can tell you just about anything, but I've selected a few and we'll just see how it goes in terms of time. So let me get started. So it was actually, it made me think, this invitation. It was actually in the beginning of the 2000s that I took up research. All the way through that decade I was working on interpreters' notes for consecutive. And then when I started out, the literature, the bulk of the literature on note-taking, and there was actually quite a lot. It's a big topic in consecutive interpreting, and I'm talking conference interpreting here. I'm not, we use notes also for community interpreting, but what I've been looking at is like long consecutive, as we say, or conference interpreting. Okay, so there was a lot. And that literature at the time, and as a matter of fact still, was a type of literature that mainly aimed at giving recommendations, so it was of the type, it was how to take notes, and it was how to teach note-taking, so directed to practitioners and teachers. The problem, as it were, and actually still is that most of the literature was based on really personal experience, which is great, but there were few or really no empirical studies to back all these recommendations. And then what we usually see in the literature is that then it points, all the recommendations, they point in different directions. So all the note-taking authors, they differed on a series of issues, and I put some of them on my slide here. Do we have it? Yeah, I put some of them down here. One of the burning issues was the question of note form, and the question then was whether symbols or natural language, that is, words and abbreviations, which one was a better choice. So just to recap a little bit, one of the conference interpreting pioneers, authors, Rosin, he was from Geneva, and actually wrote a piece all the way back to 56. It's some of the first literature at all. And he is also the author of the perhaps most widely used and taught note-taking system, at least in the West. I would like to hear whether you know it as well. Let us save that for the discussion. But we use him a lot. So he would recommend taking down most notes in a natural language, and limit the use of symbols to some, like 10 or 20 really well rehearsed symbols. And there's also a German tradition with also some of the influential literature on note-taking in Germany. It would advocate a very elaborate system of language-independent symbols, so almost a new code language. So there are differences there. There still is, and there were at the time. So another question would be the question of note language. Should it be the source language that you should take notes in, or in the target language? Okay, and actually, do you have a clue to what do most authors say in this field? And I mean, you can, in principle, you may have an entirely different literature than the literature that I know, because most Russian literature is actually quite inaccessible to a Dane like me. So I don't know. What do your teachers tell you? Source. Okay, there you go. That is very interesting.
Source language.
That is great. Because it's for some, yeah.
It's been a tradition.
It's been it is. It's also about
in the source language, not to confuse the direction.
No. That is very great because you know in Western literature, most authors would agree that it should be taken in the target language. How strange. Because the idea, the rationale is that this option then forces the interpreter away from the surface form of the source language speech and therefore makes for better processing of the text, and also because it's easier to actually produce the text in the target language once you have converted the notes into that language. But there are also a few authors in the West that say that it should, or at least question this recommendation, because it requires language conversion. That is the idea. While you take notes, and actually it's often suggested that the most complex, the cognitively most complex phase is the listening phase. So if you need to do also language conversion already there, it adds to the complexity. And that phase is also, you know, paced by the speaker, while the reformulation or the production phase is, you know, it's paced by the interpreter herself. So, okay, but that's another, you know, topic of controversy. Still many, but these are just some of them. Okay, so against this background, I set out to look at what interpreters' notes actually look like, not what they should look like, but what they actually look like. And so I made a series of simply very purely descriptive studies on issues such as the quantity of notes, so how many notes, really very simple description, the form of note, would they be abbreviations, symbols, whatever, and also note language. And then the central research question is in this type of study would just be what is, that is, what do interpreters' notes actually look like? And then later, based on some of the patterns that I found, I moved on to studying some selected cause and effect relations, so focusing not on just what is, but also what works. Like, are some notes better than others? So these are two different lines of inquiry, really. So let me start with an example of a description where the central question then is what is interpreters' notes? What are actually interpreters' notes? So I have the results on the slide here. Comes from a small-scale study of professional interpreters' notes. They were collected in a small experiment setup, and so what you can see here concerns the form of the notes. So whether they were taken, can you see whether they were taken as, let me see. Okay, I can't point with this one, I'm afraid. Okay, so look at, no, it doesn't point on the screen. But you can see that you have the note form, that will be the title. So there were like three forms: words, abbreviations, and symbols. Okay? And then very simple counts were made, and these are the results. So to me, that was what I saw when I looked at this, and I believe that they look quite different, and that it's perhaps difficult to see any patterns. But I'd like to ask you, what do you say? Do you see any patterns in this? Can you see the figures? Can you see them? You can actually look at these, 118, you have both percentages and absolute numbers. And you have screens like everywhere, so you don't need to look very far. Can you see any patterns in this? Help me a little bit here. Okay, it's often said in the literature that notes are individual, that they are very personal, and that each interpreter develops his or her own style. But it would still be nice to see if you can see any patterns here. Any suggestions? There is a tendency towards symbols. There is a tendency towards symbols. Yes, in all of them. Valerie, in all of them. No. So I have a clue here. I rearranged them. Can you see that I start with subject 1, 2, then I go to 4. Then I have a gap. Then I have subject 3 and 5. Can you see that? Can you see something happens because you're you're onto something, Valerie. So that is true. There's a tendency towards symbols down here, as you can see. It's a very good. It's a good point. Look at this. So there is, I would say, perhaps there's a bipolar pattern really. They are not completely individual styles. There is 3 of them, 1, 2, and 4. They have a preference for symbols, but the other 2 they have a preference for words. You can see those in the red here. Okay. Any other patterns that you can see here? Any other patterns that you can see in this very small table? Let me hear. Any other? Any correlations, for example? So what happens when the interpreters, for example, the first 3, we have like, this is what I have based on this evidence and also later evidence. Actually, I started talking about we have like word interpreters and then we also have symbol interpreters. It's like a bipolar pattern. It's not completely different. You can actually find patterns in these also small samples like that. What else do you see? Any correlations? Look at the bottom line. That is the total units is then that's the number of node units. That can you see there's a difference? Can you see there's a difference? You know, if I like color them a little bit, there's actually also a correlation. So those, you know, the red ones, those who prefer symbols, they tend to produce more units, more node units. They write more. This, it makes sense, completely sense, right? So subject 3 and 5, they prefer words and then they also write fewer notes, really. So that is just a very simple observation, but a correlation. Okay. Okay, so let's try to make sense of this. So it makes sense because symbols are more economical than as notes than full words, at least, provided that the symbols are simple and fully mastered by the interpreter. And also that, of course, that the full word equivalents of the symbols used are long. But then I have another red question for you. Are many notes necessarily a goal to strive for? What do your teachers tell you? Should you write a lot? No, not really. True? Okay. No, not really, because well, they're not necessary simply because a large amount of notes may not simply not be a goal to strive for, because you know, you always need to remember that the idea of notes is to serve as memory reinforcers, so that we achieve accuracy in the rendition in the target language. So a small number of notes may be as efficient, even more efficient in principle than a large number. So, okay, so this and other results then points to the relevance of looking at note-taking features from the point of view of their efficiency. In other words, to include also studies of target text quality in order to see not only what is, but move on to also see, look at what works. Okay. So I'll show you an example of such a study, and then this is actually what I'm going to talk about for a while. And then a small study that draws on quality assessments of the target text as well as description of notes. So let me see. I had, yes, an example of. That is true. That is where I am. Okay. So the idea of this study was to investigate which note-taking features appear to lead to good target text and which do not. So I was interested in identifying features of efficiency and non-efficiency in interpreters' notes. So the basic assumptions here are that that what we could call good notes linked to what we could then refer to as good target texts. So if notes are good, you're potentially able to produce good target texts. All other things at least being equal. So target text quality becomes a central issue. But then again, quality, that's a difficult one. It's a very, very big topic in interpreting. What is quality? Quality always, you know, it has many, many components, many, many aspects, and only so accuracy is actually the one that we used. Sometimes we were more, sometimes it was only me, sometimes we were more researchers. So we used accuracy as an indicator of target text quality because it's the very raison d'etre of interpreters' notes is to actually achieve a target text that is a very accurate, very precise reproduction of the source text. I mean, we could have many, many other components. It could be things like fluency, for example, fluency in the production. It could be grammatical correctness. It could be many, many things. But accuracy, we thought, was then the central point here. So now I get to my hypothesis. This study did not start from scratch, but was based on the results of a small pilot study, which then made me formulate 3 hypotheses on the relation between particular note characteristics and high and low target text quality, then measured as accuracy. And the hypotheses were those you can see on the slides. The more notes, the better the target text, and also vice versa. So the fewer notes, the worse the target text. So this is concerned with note quantity, the number of notes. Another one, the more abbreviations or the fewer full words, the better the target text, and also the other way around. It concerns then the form of the notes. And the third one is the more notes, it concerns then note language. So the more notes in the source language or the fewer in the target language, the better the target text, and also vice versa. So I will focus on the 2 first ones because I don't have the time to cover everything. Also because the analysis and results for the third hypothesis, they were really complex and very unclear. And more than anything, because it was a very weak hypothesis from the beginning on. So if I have the time when I have discussed the first 2 ones, I shall return to the question of note language, which is actually a particularly interesting one. So let us look at the data. The data are actually the same as those I showed you before. So they were drawn from a corpus generated in a simulated conference, then with consecutive interpreting between Spanish and Danish, and the corpus comprises 1 Spanish speech, which then served as, that was the source text, and then 5 consecutive interpretations of this speech into Danish. That is, there were 5 target texts, and they were produced by 5 professional interpreters with Danish as their A language. Then all the texts were transcribed, they were recorded, they were transcribed, and then they were actually divided into what I refer to as paragraphs. Some smaller units according to some semantic criteria, so units of meaning really. So each were divided into 16 paragraphs, which gives us, like, with a total of 5, that gives us 90 target text units to look at, to test the hypothesis. And then the additional source of data was then the notes that were used to produce the target texts. Okay. Well, we then did 2 kinds of analysis: comparative analysis of source text and target text in order to identify accurate target text accuracy, and also analysis of the corresponding notes in order to find out whether particular note-taking characteristics could then be linked to accuracy. So, and actually, the analysis of target text accuracy, it was in fact a very, very long story. And I have actually a separate article on that topic because we did both some very formal analysis, semantic network analysis that were very complex, but we also simply had independent raters assess accuracy rather intuitively, and that turned out to work quite well. So I will today only draw on the intuitive assessments, just to cut a long story short. Okay, so we had 7 independent assessors who assessed each of the target. We had 90 target text paragraphs for semantic accuracy, and each of them was then rated on a scale from 5 to 1 or 1 to 5, we could say, where 1 is very inaccurate and 5 very accurate. So the higher the number, the better the accuracy. And like that, we were able to identify different degrees of accuracy in the target text paragraphs, and these were then the points of the point of departure for the analysis of the notes. Okay, and then in fact, well, let me see, what do I have here? Yes. In fact, yes, I can see that I'm looking at the intersubjective analysis here. We actually made note analysis of two kinds, or in 2 phases. For the first type of analysis, we simply selected those target text paragraphs that had received the highest and the lowest accuracy scores in the corpus as a whole. So independent of which interpreter had interpreted the paragraphs in question. So essentially what we did was just to select the best and the worst target text paragraphs that there were. So with the selection criteria that you can see now on the slide, is that we sort of identified 7 paragraphs which had a total of 32 points, or 33 actually, or more points between the 7 assessors, and in this case they were considered highly accurate. Now perhaps you want to remember that the renditions were rated on a scale from 1 to 5, and that means that with 7 assessors the maximum score is 35%, 35 points. So with 33 or more, they're considered highly accurate. And then we also had those with scores below a total of 14 points, that was 13 or less, and that gave us like 8 paragraphs that we considered as highly inaccurate. Okay, so was that did not mean that I'm out of time, right?
Not yet.
No. Okay, so then what happened? You know, we had to conduct another one because what we actually had here, what these selection criteria meant that actually the seven highly accurate paragraphs, they were actually produced. It turned out to be produced by 2 interpreters only, and most of the inaccurate were produced by another 2. So 2 interpreters who were just not the same. That then we get the risk of actually looking at individual differences rather than what in general leads to accuracy in the notes and what does not. Okay, so we did another one where we simply took for each of the interpretations, each of the 5 ones, we simply took the 3 most accurate paragraphs and also the 3 most inaccurate ones, so that we could see what each interpreter does. Okay. Well, actually, this was not perfect either, because but you know, together actually, what we could get was we could look at what does one of the same interpreter do and what happens in the corpus as a whole. And none of the methods is really very completely reliable, but taken together they give quite a full picture of what is at play. So let us look at it. Let us look at what happens with hypothesis number 1, which was about note quantity. So the more notes, the better the target text, and vice versa. And then we measured the number of source text word per node unit, which means that now I'm going to show you the results now, but please note that in the table you'll see when you have high numbers, it means that you have a low quantity of nodes and vice versa, because what it measures is how many words one node unit covers. Can you see that? So it's sort of, to me, well, I'm still struggling with it. So, but that's how you need to read the results. So, okay. So let me see. Yes, let me see. Let me try to explain. So the first box, I have one marked in red here. The first box in the accurate table refers, for example, to the result of the analysis of the nodes produced by interpreter number 2. So the first number refers to the interpreter. And then it's for paragraph number 1, and there were like 16 for each of them. Okay, and then you can, here you can see that 3 of the highly accurate renditions, they are produced actually by subject number 3. Can you see that? That is a very accurate interpreter. And then another 3 are produced by subject number 4. That was what I referred to first. Okay, and you can see the same in the bottom one. We have interpreter number 1 and interpreter number 5. They mainly down there. Okay, that is why we did the other kind of analysis, to really to avoid the risk of looking just at different interpreters, really. Okay, let me see. If you look at the rightmost columns in the 2 tables, the red ones, you can see that actually on average more nodes do in fact connect with accurate renditions, and fewer nodes connect with inaccurate renditions. You can see that again, you know, low numbers means many nodes. Okay? So that's what happened here, and you can also, if you look at the individual performances, that you can also see that, let me see what you can see, that the lowest node quantities, they are to be found in the inaccurate table, and vice versa. The highest quantities in the accurate, okay, with the numbers that I have highlighted. But there are, of course, some deviations. You can see here that there are some deviations. We also get inaccurate with high numbers and accurate with low numbers. So that is why we did also the other one. This one was the intra-subject, where we looked at each of the 5 interpreters. So as you can see here, in all 5 cases, actually, the results, they converge. So all 5 interpreters wrote more notes in order to produce the 3 most accurate target text paragraphs than she or he did for the 3 most inaccurate paragraphs. You can also see that the exact amount of notes, it varies from interpreter to interpreter, but the general pattern actually remains the same. So there are a lot of variations here, but you can also see patterns. Okay? So actually we can say that the results of this and also the other analysis would then support the hypothesis, the hypothesis of the relationship between target text quality and node quantity. So let's look at the next one, which was about node form. It was about abbreviations. We didn't look at symbols here. Actually, symbols did not seem to have any effect. That was really disappointing and also a bit strange, but they didn't. So let us look at abbreviation versus full words. So we worked with these 3 categories of node form: full words, abbreviations, and then not symbols here. And let us see what we get. Again, we have a hypothesis that's intuitively plausible, because, you know, the more you can abbreviate your words, you know, the shorter they are, the more economical. So it makes good sense. Okay, so from the intersubjective analysis, as we called it, Well, on this slide I have highlighted the highest numbers again. This is where you get the highest numbers. And as you can see, we get a relatively stable correlation between high target text accuracy and a high number of abbreviations and a smaller number of full words. And we also have like the inverse. You know, on the whole, there are some exceptions. You know, both in the average numbers, but also in most of the individual performances. So again, we have two exceptions. As far as I can see, we have 3.3 and 3.13. They are two of the highly accurate renditions, which are nevertheless based on more full words than abbreviations. But then again, they are produced by the same interpreter. And this is where then the next type of analysis comes in really, really handy, because we can then see that even this interpreter, she's a real word interpreter, but she too performs better when she uses more abbreviations. You can see that in the next type of analysis. Look at her. You can see it over there, right? That you can see that with the relative distribution of abbreviations and words and accurate, inaccurate, she gets actually the same pattern as all the others. So it's a very good point to actually try and analyze things from various perspectives to like get the full picture. Okay. So let us see. Yes, I think that was perhaps. Let me just move on to the conclusion so that we have, I'm not quite sure how much, I still have like 5 minutes at least. Yes, okay. So at least I can conclude. So to sum up, so far we tested then two hypotheses and they turned out to be substantiated by the results. So both regarding note quantity and also regarding note form. So again, we talked about economy in note taking. That is a very, very generally recommended principle. But according to these results, then it seems that it should not be taken to apply to cover note quantity per se, because relatively many notes actually seem to be conducive of target text accuracy. So, but of course, the principle of economy can be applied then to note form, because abbreviations, under the right circumstances, seem to be more economical and more efficient than full words. So, a few other things here. That is really, this is my favorite finding really, that the general trends in the data that I've analyzed here, they are really clear. It's still true that the individual variability is very, very high. I showed you that in some of the slides. I think here you can see the variability is actually quite high, but there are still patterns. Okay, so interpreter 1 does one thing, and then we have the other two. Let me see, what do I have here? Then we have 1 and 3. They do something completely different, but still overall we have patterns. So this means really that we have regularities beyond individual variations. And really, if we take that up one step or one level of abstraction, it also means that it makes sense to perform research into note-taking. Because if notes were just completely individual, completely personal, it would not make sense at all to look at what, because it would always be a question of what works for one interpreter. But here you can see we're actually able to find some patterns that apply to all the interpreters, even if we have a lot of variation. So that, and also more good news for you guys is that much more research needs to be done also on note-taking. For example, it would be really nice to have replications, simple, repetitions of the same studies, Both in general, it will be nice to actually look at this, just to generate a larger database, but it would also be great to vary with the parameters that we look at. Like, for example, it could be different language pairs. This one was only about Spanish, Danish. Would be great to include Russian, for example. Would be great to look at other languages, other language directions. I think you perhaps have a tradition for working also into the B. We do that in Denmark as well. That is not like a standard recommendation, but in the West at least. But in Denmark we do it because Denmark it's a small country, it's a small language. So I mean, no interpreter can just say, no, I only work into my mother tongue. This interpreter would never find work. So that is not an option simply. Okay. So, you know, varying all the parameters, looking at other text types. The text type I looked at here was an argumentative text. So to actually look and see if previous findings are replicable and also solid. Okay. I can see there are more good news. So lots of topics that remain uncovered and should be picked up. To give just a few examples, I was just thinking, doing a little bit of brainstorming to see what else we need to do. Very specific technical issues such as the representation of logical links in notes, the organization of notes on the notepad, the use and role of symbols, which I also left uncovered, the role of text type, genre. Is note-taking, for example, the same when interpreting a ceremonial speech as when interpreting a technical speech? Probably not. The role of experience and educational background also in note-taking. Many Danish interpreters, they sort of have the same kind of educational or schooling, at least the background. They are trained in Roson's note-taking system. And so that is also what we see with them. So again, also experience, because do young interpreters' notes resemble those of more experienced interpreters? If not, how do they differ? How do they differ? And one burning issue, I believe, is the use of technology, as in any area. Do some interpreters take notes on a computer? And if so, does that change note-taking? I know some does. Some do, actually. And how does it change note-taking? Some schools, even I know in Australia, they have their students use a smart pen. Ever heard about a smart pen? Okay, so it can translate and find words, and what do you have? So does that change note-taking? That will be extremely interesting to see in a small experiment, one using the smart pen, one not using it. Okay, and then finally, just to conclude, I listed this because I assume that you'll get my slides somehow. I just list some of the references to my work if you're interested. And then, you know, then only if we have time. But let me just perhaps step down right now. Because I could rather quickly show you a study on interpreters' choice of language for their notes if we have the time. But perhaps we should take a few questions first. Wouldn't that be nice? Yes. Exactly. Also because I've been talking too much, but I would be able to do that in 5 minutes, because the one on language is really interesting. It's if we have time. Let me hear if we have questions, perhaps comments.
Shall we clap?
Not yet. Okay. Are you the moderator?
I can be.
That would be because you know them. I only know one.
Okay, thank you very much, Helle. I would like to underline, because you are a young researcher, the rigor of the study, meaning that she has formulated hypotheses, she has defined very clearly what she wants to do, and a few key words. And also, maybe you have noticed, during the whole process she presents her research, she kept a very critical mind, right from the beginning. So you have also to exercise your self-criticism very strongly. And then at the end, she underlined the limitation of what she has been doing. and open new avenues that research should continue.
Okay.
And I think this is quite important for the young scholars.
That's good. That's good
Yeah.
point. Yes.
I mean, I don't talk about your research as such now,
No.
but the way you proceed.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
in 1 hour, less than 1 hour, you get a good piece of research and how to present piece of research. So I hope this kind of exercise could inspire you. Now, the floor is yours. If you want some ask questions or comments or remarks with your own experience, or maybe if you did not understand some aspect of the presentation,
Yeah.
then please go ahead.
So we have at least 3 questions.
That's great.
Okay. So what would you call a long consecutive? How do you say, what is the duration, average duration of a long consecutive?
At least a few minutes.
A few minutes.
Yes.
Okay.
That would be the duration, but you also usually look at other aspects, like, for example, the fact that it's monological, that where what is not a long consecutive is usually a dialogue. So yeah, and this is actually, did I say long consecutive at all?
Yeah, you said long
Okay, I did.
consecutive, so-
Good. Yes, exactly. So long. It's just that there is that's a tradition to also refer to it as long consecutive, as also as real consecutive, as a matter of fact, really. The type of consecutive that is done in the context of conferences, and they are very often they are monologues rather than dialogues. So, but long would be more than a few minutes. So that, you know, I think the point here is, if you need to take notes, it's long. Yeah. You need to, if you need to exercise long-term memory, it will be long, which you actually do here, and also use presentation skills. Very often, that is another thing that characterizes it. Very often, you would be standing as an interpreter. You would be standing in front of perhaps the podium, and in front of an audience with long consecutive. Whereas if it's dialogues, it's you usually sit. Yeah.
And then my second question is, I was just wondering when listening
That's
to
great.
the presentation, whether there is a dependence between the ratio of abbreviation symbols and full words, depending on the time of interpretation. So is the ratio the same when interpreters actually start interpreting and when they finish?
Yeah.
End of the day.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Not the
that
end
is-
of the long consecutive, but
that
the
is-
end of the day.
That
Yeah,
is.
but I think this is quite important because
Yeah, is. Yeah.
we don't work as long as you do. So
Well,
no.
how long
20,
do you work?
20 one turn would be in the EU. 20 minutes is one turn.
And then you have
Then
a
it's
break.
over to the next. You know, we have these double, like I saw you have.
Yeah.
You also have
Work
two.
full day, like
No, but
7 hours, 6
they work.
hours.
Yeah. The same interpreters can actually work for the full day, but they always have a colleague
But here they can break
without break.
No break, one interpreter.
Oh, great. But in the EU,
You
for
really
example,
sit, right?
you can never reassemble. If you attend a meeting in the EU, you can never reassemble after lunch until 1 hour and a half has passed, because you know, because the interpreters need the break. So it's highly regulated, really.
But do you think there is a dependence?
I think that is a very good question. I think that is one of those that we could add to the list of unanswered questions, because intuitively, yes,
Yeah,
right?
that's what I was-
So that which then intuitively yes, which makes it a very good question, and we could then add it to the very long list of things that we need to look at. Is there a difference between the morning and the afternoon? And all these things can be actually looked at easily. You know, actually, these are just counts. In a way they are. You know, I try and control all the way, but you know, actually what I do is just, you know, counting. How many notes do we get in the morning? How many notes do we get in the evening, for example? That could be done. Also, you know, collecting among same interpreters under different circumstances. So I think it's a very good point. And it's intuitively very interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah.
In this research, did you also
Can you speak out because it's really
Yeah, oh, you can.
also take into consideration whether the interpreters had some previous knowledge about the topic of the text?
Yes.
They had to choose-
Yes. Actually, all this is all experimental. Usually, when you want to look at what works, you would always try and look at it experimentally. So these were carefully selected. I didn't have time to talk about it, but these were carefully selected. They had many years. All of them had many years of experience working for the EU institutions, actually, as permanent interpreters. So there is not a high variability actually here in there, because that could be another parameter that would also influence. So here what I'm trying to, even in collecting the data and afterwards when analyzing the results, I just try to put in controls everywhere. And the group of interpreters is very they are similar in many parameters. They have at least 5 years of experience, but several of them more. But I think that could influence it as well. It could be really interesting to look at all these parameters. So schooling, background, experience, time of the day, just adding parameters. I mean, we could go on forever. And all this needs to be researched, really. So there is plenty of ground for you to just go ahead for your thesis.
Maybe I should insist on one thing. Helle called for replication of the same type of research.
Yeah.
So for your MA thesis, you do not have necessarily to find a new topic, but sometimes you have to do the same kind of research which have been carried out somewhere else with a different language spec.
Yeah.
And like you said at the beginning of your presentation, I think we need more research based on languages which are not Indo-European languages.
Yeah.
And languages like Arabic and Chinese and Korean, Japanese, but also with Russian. So in fact, we are working mainly with the same type of languages, except Finnish.
Yeah, exactly, or Danish. Yeah.
I think we need to extend.
Yeah.
And the result of what we are doing maybe are not validated by other languages.
Exactly.
So I think here you have a lot of work to be done to do.
Exactly.
And again, I will insist for your MA thesis or even for your PhD, for those who want to do PhD, you do not have necessarily to find a completely new topic.
No, or
you can base your work on something which has been done and then compare the results.
And even using the same methodology, because it was interesting for I don't know, I think many students probably think it's really interesting, the thing about note-taking, because I have, there's a PhD student now in Mons, Helle Dam, who took up like my methodology, but she's putting on, looking at perhaps other parameters, but using the same, categorizing like abbreviations, symbols, full words, using all these also in languages and stuff, replicating really, but varying with some of the parameters, some of the languages. There's also, and that was, now I don't know what kind of student, but actually in interpreting, that's a respectable journal. A young researcher actually had a publication taking on the same methodology, exactly the same, like it was exactly the same, but just putting in Hungarian and English. And she actually got other results that I had. It was about language. So that is actually, so to show you that it's valid as research, it counts actually to replicate rather than invent the wheel again. So it's you're standing also on safer grounds, I think, as young scholars. If you try and see what's done out there, try to use the same like framework, methodology, and try to apply it with some other parameters like different languages.
Yes, I did mention about this criteria of the language,
Yeah.
and social language. That would be interesting to hear your viewpoint.
Yeah.
Why is it?
Yeah, I have a full presentation, or I would, yes, exactly. It's extremely interesting. So if I have a few minutes in the end, I will just show some results that I have and some counter results, because it's really interesting.
Yes.
Yeah. So let us see, depending on how we prioritize.
It depends on
Q&A, or I'll show you. I can show you. Should I show you quickly what I have?
Yes, please.
Should I show you quickly what I have? Is it okay?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
For everybody, not for me.
This no.
Your response is like either or. I mean, no mixture. Like
No.
The sources, right?
There will usually be a mix, and I found a mix. I found two important parameters influencing. Let me say quite quickly. I'll just show you what I find. This again, what I'm reading is Western literature. This, I said, okay, interpreters' choice of language for their notes. Okay, so again, you always like start in the literature, see what do all these prominent authors, what do they say. I actually mentioned it before that most authors would say take notes in the target. In the Western literature, we talked about that already, right? Take notes in the target language. Because then you can better process, you don't get like word. Then you can better process, you need to reformulate, and then it's easier when you stand there and need to produce your target text. Okay, but some authors say, okay, no, probably not. Probably not. So this was the point of departure. So there was this disagreement on which language to be used, but agreement that the relevant categories, and I think that was your question, that is coming back to your question, the relevant categories would be source language or target language. Okay, so again I look at what actually does, what do interpreters do in real life? Not what should they do, but what do they actually do. So again, I took the same kind of data that I presented to you earlier, and I looked at the note language in that data set, and then again, looking at my categories, talking about replicating categories. I had words, abbreviations, and symbols. Of course, that the only point I wish to make here, because this is not relevant for this study, is that not all notes, of course, are language-based. It's only the words and the abbreviations. The symbols are not necessarily language-based, so we need to filter those out. Forget about them for a while. And then what I found, categories of language, I found target language, but based on the literature, of course. I found source language. I also found a third language, because I had Danish and Spanish. I found that many of the interpreters actually also used notes in English. So they also used a third language, but that's no wonder, because looking in the literature, they say that we have some very short English connectives, like so and but. So they're very short. So they use English as well. They also, there were also some that I just could not identify because a word like legal, for example, would be the same in Danish, in Spanish, in English, in many languages. So there were some that I also just needed to filter out. So, okay, that was what I got. Look at the first study, same set of data. Look at what they do, the red ones. So it's target language, right? They use it much less the source language. They do use it, but, and this is, but then, so again, the generally recommended note-taking language is the preferred one. But then I noticed that the target language then here is also the interpreter's mother tongue. It's their A language. So it gets complicated. What is it that they're doing? So I conducted another study with many more language variables, because there were like both directions, A into B, B into A. And also with interpreters where 3 of them had, it's only, it's difficult to come around professional interpreters who are willing to actually participate in a study like that. But very often, and with small combination, you're only able to find very few ones. But I had like 4, a small sample of interpreters. 3 had Danish A, Spanish B, another one had Spanish A, and so the other way around. So more variables. Look at what happens when we look at the direction Spanish into Danish. We actually get same results, because they use target language, except from the one who has the source as the A. Can you see that? She goes the other way around. Not target language, but actually source language. So then I needed to ask myself, okay, what about the other way around? Then if we go Danish into Spanish, so you simply reverse the language direction, then we get the completely different, the completely opposite pattern. Then we get source language suddenly, or the others, those that chose target language before, they now choose source language, and vice versa with the one with the special one. So okay, that needs to we need to look at that. So they take what we can see is that they take notes in their A language much more than in their B. It doesn't matter whether it's the source language or the target language. So where it's been so far assumed, at least in the Western literature, that the language is determined by the language's status in the language combination. Well, in the task, source language, target language, perhaps A and B also plays a role. So what I'm saying is, it may be a question of choice between A and B rather than source language versus target language. Again, perhaps assuming that this is the language of least effort. That is the language that takes least effort to actually write down. The interesting thing here was that a young scholar took up exactly this same methodology, reversing directions and languages and doing things with Hungarian and English. And she found they had a Hungarian A, her interpreters. And she found that they actually used the B language more. And her explanation was perhaps because English is a simpler language, it's shorter than Hungarian. I have no knowledge of Hungarian, but it's probably, if she says so, that's probably right. So she said, okay, then it's no longer. She agreed. It's not a question actually of source and target. That remains. But perhaps not A and B, but really just the easiest language. It can, to some, it can be the A, because people are familiar with their own language. It can also be a very short language, a very practical language, if it's English or something easy. But at least, in any case, the language of least effort, I would love to see a replication of that study with Russian. Is Russian a long language?
Yeah, it's a long language.
Yeah, okay. And so English is shorter. I would love to see what you could do with that.
Actually,
That would be great.
One of the criteria, the duration of interpretation, is one of the criteria of assessment of the quality of translation. It's not only accuracy, but
No, absolutely,
of interpretation.
absolutely. So you're talking about quality criteria. That is, you have a huge number. Are you aware that in Spain, in Granada, there is going to be a conference in October about quality? Yeah. About quality, another one about quality, Granadan quality. So with all these different criteria, accuracy, duration, fluency, many things. Yeah, that was, in short, I think this is my university. So let me.
May I ask you one question? Okay, still with your presentation.
Yeah.
I have still one question to ask.
Yes, sorry.
You talk quite a lot about correlations.
Yeah.
Can you explain the differences between correlation and explanation?
Yes,
Okay,
I can. No, I can try.
So she explained that there is correlation between languages and notes and things, but that doesn't mean we don't know how to explain the correlation. So you make the difference between correlation and explanations.
I think perhaps what you really want to ask is, what is the difference between correlations and cause and effect?
Yes, let's do that.
Yes, exactly, because that is an assumption. That is a rather shaky assumption even. When I see correlations, what I do is my claim about cause and effect, because that I have a claim about cause and effect with efficiency and note, the character of the notes. I do that based on logics, really. I argue that notes, they have this and that function. I assume that there is a cause and effect relation. But all I'm able to see in this kind of study, all that I'm able to see is actually correlation. I can only see what coexists. If I were to do a real causal study, I would have to do a true experiment where I would have a control group apart from an experimental group. Here I have only one experimental group. I would usually also have a blind, a blind group, a group where you give them, you don't give them the treatment. That there is only one group. There is, there's a particular structure actually for experiments where you want to look at cause and effect. That you have first a pre-test, then you give them a treatment, a manipulation, because this is what they usually do in medical research. You know what they do is actually they take out one experimental group and then they give them the medication. They see if it works. They also take a control group. They give them something that they say is a medication, but it's not. And then see, will we see also effect of that? Because we really only want the effect in the experimental group. So this is not a design that actually allows me to conclude anything about cause and effect. So it's very important to say. I skipped that one because I thought it was too technical, but it's this. All I see here is the correlation.